It has been probably 60 years ago that a prominent theologian came onto the scene in the United States and then around the world. I've never read much of his material, to be honest with you. As a pastor's kid, my dad had several of his books, and there was always one in particular as I grew out of my childhood years and up into the college years. There was one in particular that Dad had that in the title always intrigued me, and the title of the book was, "How Then Should We Live?" And it was a very powerful book, as I would soon find out, one of 19 books. I pulled that book out and thought about what it was saying, and then I realized there's so much there for us to really answer the question, how then should we live? I think we've got to answer that question, particularly now, particularly in this moment where we're dealing with life as we've never known it. How then shall we live was his title. And I'm using it to say, how then should we live? Let me show you something from the book. His premise was, as a Christian-dominated consensus weakened, and these are his words, as the Christian-dominated consensus weakened, as our influence weakened, in other words, the majority of these Christian people adopted two, what he calls impoverished values. Personal peace was one, and two was affluence. And here's what he said about each one of those. He says, personal peace means just to be left alone, not to be troubled by the troubles of others, to live one's life with the minimal possibilities of being personally disturbed, regardless of what the result will be in the lifetime of my children and my grandchildren. In some ways, he's questioning what kind of example do we want to set? What kind of legacy do we want to leave? The second piece of this, those two things he was noticing in the Christian culture, and this is 50 some years ago, the second one being affluence. Here's what he said. Affluence means an overwhelming and ever-increasing prosperity, a life made up of things, and more things. You would think he was talking about 2020. This was said some 30, 40 years ago by this young author. For those who did not find peace in their life in this world, they often would become very angry at those who have. And the anger boils even more when the affluence of the world has not included them, has not included you or us. And anger sets in, and far too many people these days, we know, young kids are growing up angry. I hear that word over and over in our prisons, anger. There are a few examples in the United States of what happens when people get really angry, and one of those you find right here in Oklahoma City. It was Wednesday, April 19th, 1995, that a bomb exploded in the middle of downtown Oklahoma City. And it forever changed this city. It claimed the lives of 168 men, women, and children. We found ourselves at the epicenter of a very troubled time in our country and in our world, and we immediately began to wonder in Oklahoma City, how could this happen here? Doesn't this happen in places far away, in war zones around the world that we see on the news? How could this happen here? We are this week remembering the 25th anniversary of the Oklahoma City National Memorial. It's a fabulous thing that has emerged from those ashes. This week, I had a chance to sit down with Carrie Watkins, the executive director of the museum. She's basically was the first employee hired, and she has been working at this now 25 years. Carrie and her husband, Marty, have been a part of my life for decades, been a part of this church for a long time, blessed us with two kids, 18 years ago with Ford and 16 years ago with Caroline. Carrie is on our board of elders, is a great leader, not only in our city, but in our church as well. So I had a chance to sit down with her. I'd like to take you to that interview.
There's a comment, it's on the wall. The spirit of this city and this nation will not be defeated. Our deeply rooted faith sustains us. Where'd that come from? What was, you remember what was kind of the catalyst for that phrase?
I really do. That was a line that Billy Graham used on the Sunday after the bombing and the nationwide prayer service at the fairgrounds. And he had that line in his speech. And ironically, the names of the survivors on the first memorial design, the names of the survivors were going to go on the inside of that tree. But our mission statement said the names of the survivors had to be on the footprint of the building somewhere in that space by the chairs. And so the designers went back and they took original granite salvaged from the site and etched those names and put those on the footprint of the building. And so we had this whole inside of the wall empty. So the designers said to the memorial committee, you guys figure out what you want to be in there. But that was something that we had to stay within the mission. We had to put the survivor names on the footprint. And so we had this beautiful space around the survivor tree. And so we began to look at speeches. Jeanette Gamba and Clark Bailey and I began to look through words that had been said, powerful words. And we came across Billy Graham's quote of, our deeply rooted faith sustains us. And so we looked at that and called Reverend Graham's office, say, could we use that? We had to put that in writing. We sent it to him. And he wrote back on the same letter we wrote, absolutely, you can use that quote, but please don't put my name on it. This is not about me. So I think about that a lot, just kind of his humility, what a powerful line that was for us, and really how faith has played such an important role in our healing over the past 25 years.
Talk about that a little more. You know, here we are doing this interview in the middle of a pandemic that is unlike anything we've ever experienced, at least in my life and yours. And so faith seemed to be the key for the memorial and for this 25 years and preserving the history and the reason people, you know, this faith sustained us. So you know what it looked like for the last 25 years for the memorial. What do you think it'll look like for us when this current issue is over?
Yeah, I mean, I do think faith has played a huge part in our healing. The panel behind me is a panel in the museum that talks about the role faith played. When you look and talk to the family members and survivors and first responders, many of them relied on their faith, as well as a good counselor, a good psychiatrist or psychologist. But many of them relied on their women's group at church or their men's group or many different ways. And so I think people's faith, whatever it was, got them through this. And if it was a priest or a pastor or a rabbi, they all figured out how to walk the journey with them. And I look, you know, even at Crossings, some of the survivors who sat out in that audience, I realize the role that they have, the journey we've taken them on. I just think faith has played a big part in Oklahoma City's healing. It was something that I give a lot of that credit to Kathy Keating. She organized that first prayer service. She asked Reverend Billy Graham to come in. He was sick with the flu and he felt like he could do it. She talked about recently that he was so weak he could hardly climb the stairs to the stage. Yet when he took the podium, like the power of God came over him and delivered this message of really for all time. You'll remember after 9/11, they copied almost the exact service. When we faxed them our program, they copied almost the exact service at the National Cathedral with Reverend Billy Graham and President George Bush. And because President Bush had been here as the governor of Texas and he remembered it. And so I do think from the very early days, faith played a big part in it. And we continue to go to our faith. I don't think it's not ironic that this happens to be on a Sunday morning, this 25th anniversary. It does change a lot of what we had planned, and just like it has Easter services at last week at our church, and this has become a nuisance almost to us. But in the power of public health and trying to make sure we protect ourselves, we're all trying to abide by it. So I do think that when we get through it, it is what sustains us in the long run. Faith does play the role that sustains us. And it is almost overwhelming to realize, you had an entire series planned for Easter and you couldn't do what we had planned at Crossings. Same here. The same with state basketball championships or, whatever the plan is, graduations and proms, all these things we had planned and we lived for, it's not to be. And so I think it is a point for us to reset and think about what can we do and what will we grow? What will we be coming out of this? And I certainly hope people begin to rely on their faith and use their faith more and more as we step out of this.
Anything else you would say to your church family about this season of our life with this virus and celebrating the 25th? It's not going to be quite what you'd planned.
Two things I want to say to the Crossings people who have literally been there for us every year. I think back on the role Crossings has played on this site, and Marty, you and Kim and Ron sang at the dedication. There was a 168 person choir that George put together. I think through the years we've had Charity and Carmen and Cole and Josh. So many people from Crossings have come, and Sandy shared their talents here on this site. I don't take that for granted, and we do things differently at Crossings, and they're at a high standard, and that's the same standard I think we've brought to this site. Just having that resource and being able to lean on you guys has been a great blessing to me, and I personally thank everyone who's made that possible, and that's been a 25-year gift, and I appreciate that. Bob Johnson and I just finished a book, and we talked about you and you guys singing on that day and how powerful that was, but I just think back really at the journey the city has been on, and I do believe God's put us in this place to be the city on the hill. We have a chance to really let our light shine, and it's like this week the national media has woken up and realized it's the 25th anniversary, and they realize there's something different about the people of Oklahoma City and the people of Oklahoma. We were in New York recently when the team was wearing the memorial uniform, and to go back and see those rescue teams and to hear them say, you guys taught us by how you live. And I think that's just a challenge we have as Oklahomans, is just to keep living the Oklahoma standard, the way that people recognized us, which was just taking care of our neighbor. I mean, that's the most biblical thing we can do, is just take care of one another, and just to be there for one another, and to carry each other through whatever journey it is on life. This place is not everybody lost somebody here, but everybody can use this site as a memory of what it takes to come together and to be united and to put aside your differences and work toward the better of a community. And that means churches and synagogues and the houses of worship, of all kinds, just coming together for the greater good of Oklahoma City. And I think that's I think it's where Crossing stands out. And I'm really proud of just how we lead in the city and the things we do.
Well, and I'm thankful that you're one of our leaders and one of our elders and one of our decision makers, and I'm very appreciative.
This tragedy left our city in a head-spinning state of insecurity. How do we recover from this? How will our economy survive? Are there other unknown enemies out there desiring to hurt us? How long will it take to rebuild our city? And how will we get it done? And what will we be when this is behind us? We could have easily said, borrowing Francis Schaeffer's words, our personal peace was shaken, our affluence jeopardized, and we wondered, how are we going to do this? How then shall we live? We find ourselves in another historic moment right now, affecting the whole planet. I've never been alive at a time when the world shut down. It has stopped. And again, in many ways, our personal peace and whatever our idea of affluence is, it has very much been jeopardized. And we're asking the question, how are we going to get through this? I want to go back to last weekend. I want to go back to Easter Sunday. If you didn't get to watch last Sunday, I hope you will do that, because it'll make today's message make a little more sense to you, because I'm really coming out of last week's message with the rest of the story. So I'm going to go back to last weekend. If you remember, those of you who heard it, that we spoke of the all 3 days in the story of Easter: Good Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. And on Easter Sunday, we parked on Saturday because we rarely spend any time on that day. We talk Friday, and then we talk Sunday. And last week on Easter, we talked about Saturday. I want to go back to that. For the follower of Christ, we talked that Friday was a day of confusion. It was a day of despair. Jesus had tried to tell them this was going to happen. He described it in perfect detail, but they didn't want to hear it. He tried to tell them many times, for example, in Mark chapter 10, we're going to Jerusalem, where the Son of Man will be betrayed to the leading priests and the teachers of religious law. They will sentence him to die and hand him over to the Romans. Here's what the Romans will do to him. They will mock him, spit on him, flog him with a whip, kill him, but after 3 days, he will rise again. His followers could not fathom what he was really saying and how it could be true. How could the one who made the blind man see, the lame man walk, a sick man well, a dead man alive again, how could this man who showed extraordinary kindness to women, how could anybody want to snuff out his life? But they did. They couldn't fathom this being true. But he had one more thing to do, the very reason he had come in the first place, and he told them that too. He said, look, even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. He's trying to make clear what I've just told you is going to happen. For whatever reason, they chose not to either listen or believe it. And Friday came. On that Friday, the followers of Jesus, but for the most part, were denying him. They were defeated. They were devastated. They were afraid. They were hiding. That's what they were doing on Friday when all of what Jesus told them came true. And then it was Saturday. For the followers of Jesus, Saturday was full of questions. How did we let this happen? How will we get through this? What will our life look like now that he's gone? Are we next to be crucified? But there was another group that Saturday feeling very different than the Christ followers. On that Saturday, I can kind of envision the religious leaders and the power brokers, the political center of power in Rome. I kind of envisioned them if high-fiving or perhaps sitting around saying, mission accomplished. This needed to happen. It was best. Some of them obviously spent some time with Jesus. They were the power brokers who had to find a way to get rid of him. He was too radical. He was too nice to bad people. He included those who didn't deserve to be included. Their legalistic, controlling religious system was being threatened, and they had no intention of letting anyone disturb their version of peace and affluence. Jesus, they said, was stirring up people, increasingly not stirring them up to overflow the religious elite, but that's what they feared was happening. Jesus was stirring up people because he had held out the hope that God really did love them and they could be forgiven. They could be loved by the one who made them. The religious leaders had to make clear to everybody what will happen if anybody tries this again. Perhaps the religious leaders might have been sitting on that Saturday having a glass of wine and talking about the accomplishments of the week. Saturday was a really good day for them. They probably, again, a few could have said, he did some really kind things. He said a lot of things that made sense. He was a good man, let's say. Seemed to be a good man, but all that radical God talk, those radical pronouncements that he was going to die and then come back to life. Now remember, they did put guards at the tomb, just in case. I envision their Saturday being a day where they kind of spent some time discussing theological and cultural and social issues. Now the country would be back at peace. All those who'd been stirred up would now calm down. Boy, were they wrong. And then Sunday came. Some might say that all hell broke loose, but that couldn't be true because Jesus had destroyed hell's power to break loose. Hell's greatest possession was death, the kind of death that kills people spiritually and emotionally and physically, the kind of death that destroys hope. Jesus destroyed hell's power to do that. Jesus destroyed death even of a person who's still physically living, and death to those who are dying. And then Sunday came. Sunday, truth won. Sunday, the most frightened among them became the bravest. The world of the religious elite was completely turned upside down. Christ followers that day were given a very different concept of peace and affluence. One of the disciples needed a bit more evidence to really believe all this, and Jesus was kind enough to give it to him. It was Thomas who came to Jesus and Jesus said to him, Thomas, put your finger here, see my hands? Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe. You may remember something I said on Easter Sunday about Thomas, that he would later, some 40 years later, refuse to stop talking about Jesus. He would not deny what he knew to be true. And a spear was thrust through him that killed him and took his life. By the way, those followers who were hiding on Saturday never hid again. And folks, surely you understand, you cannot get that many people to hold a lie that long. Because 12 men testified they'd seen Jesus raised from the dead, then they proclaimed that truth for some 40 years, never once denying it. Every one of them beaten, tortured, stoned, and put in prison. They would not have endured that for that long of a time for sure if it were not true. There's proof Jesus was on the planet. Not many would deny that. There's just trouble with that coming from the dead thing because they can't find a body, and they never will. On Sunday, truth won. Here's my question for you. Have the courage to identify those 3 days, Friday, Saturday, or Sunday. Which one are you living? Are you a Friday type that hides for fear that others will know you follow Jesus? Are you a Saturday type that would say he's a good man? He did a lot of things for many people. It seems very real to billions of people over time these past 2,000 years. You may say there's enough that makes me feel good about life, about him. I'm not going to deny him, and I'm going to follow him actually, but on my terms. I'll throw in a check every now and then. Don't disturb my way of life. I won't allow my personal peace or my affluence to be minimized. I'll gather at the church when I'm in town. Gathering with other believers is really not that big of a need of mine, but I sure like those people when I'm with them. They seem to be very nice. That's a Saturday person. And I think there are a lot of people who think they're following Jesus, who really are following him to a point, but they're following him through Saturday. Or are you a Sunday person? You remember what you were before you met him. You remember feeling that you might not be worth anything to anyone. And some crazy church-going follower of Jesus loved you anyway. Somebody showed up for you and reminded you that no one in God's eyes is ever finished. No one in God's eyes is ever finished. Somebody put their arms around you and started being painfully honest and admitting, hey, I've been where you've been. I've been through a nasty divorce. I've cheated on a spouse. I've ruined my finances. I've been addicted to everything you can be addicted to. Hey, I'm going to stick with you as long as you'll let me. Others would open the Bible and it made sense like it never had before. Have you been there? People that have it all found that more out was so much having more than just what they were leaning on and depending on in their own hands. They found the joy of giving stuff away. They weren't worried about their affluence, and they found out the more you let go of, the more he'll give you to let go of. That's biblical principle. Which day with Jesus are you living in? You have to be honest about this because you're living in one of them. Friday, Saturday, or Sunday. Which one? We're living in an unprecedented moment right now on this planet. And we're asking, what's it going to be like when this is over? How will we get through this? What about the economy? What about my job? What about my retirement? What about my rent? How then should we live? Here's something you may not have heard before, but I think it's one of the coolest things Jesus ever said, that as believers in this generation, we can cling to and hold to it. It was after Thomas had touched the scars of Jesus and he believed. And Jesus said something in that moment to all the disciples that was so amazing. And he was talking about us. He said, because you've seen me, Thomas, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen me and yet have believed. You realize that last sentence is us. Blessed are those who have not seen me. That's us. And yet have believed. If you have faith and you have believed, he says you'll be blessed. Blessed are those who have not seen me and yet have believed. So I ask you, what do you believe? Are you honest enough to identify where you've been living? And is that where you want to stay? Do you want to stay hiding on Friday? Do you want to stay believing in a good man on Saturday? Or do you want a life out there on the edge because the power of Jesus Christ can raise the dead, change our lives, forgive our sins, not hold our past against us, use us as long as we'll let him? If you'd like to discuss this further, you know we're always happy to talk about that. It would be our joy to have that kind of a conversation with you. You let us know when you're ready, and we'll be there. Let me pray. Father, give us courage. We've just come through the defining moment of Christianity. And without Friday and without the resurrection on Sunday, none of this would be necessary. Father, we thank you for what you've done for us. We thank you that somebody told us about it. We thank you that our hearts and minds were changed when we heard it. We thank you that as we've followed you over time, you've stuck with us when we were down, helped us always get up, and loved us either way. Father, I pray that would be something every person could know. And I pray it in Jesus' name. Amen.